Well, I've got my jazz hat on, so it must be about jazz, but because this is the 1970s, who knows what it's about. So I'm reading today from this book called Jazz in the 1970s, Diverging Streams. And everything about the 70s is really contentious. About this book it brings up everything that's contentious. But one of the annoying things about it is the numbering of the chapters. It's all about 1970, and the years are one of the few numbering systems that begin with 0. So you get 1970, 1971, 1972. So he's tried to tie up one chapter with 1 year. So he's got chapter 2, 1971. And it would have been so much nicer if it could have been chapter 1, 1971, and chapter 2, 1972, and so on. But that would have mean having a chapter 0 for 1970. Anyway, that's quite ridiculous, that lot. So anyway, this is about many things. One is, what is jazz? That's a big problem, because people call anything jazz, like haircuts and cars, they call it jazz. And so Charlie Parker, when he was talking about bebop, says it's no love child of the old jazz. And he's right, it's nothing like the old jazz. And the same with free jazz, that's nothing like anything at all. And whether they should all be called jazz is, I don't know, total nonsense really. And the other contentious thing is whether people without technique have anything legitimate to say in any artistic field. It's like art, painting, and all that sort of thing, whether people's ramblings and sticking of squares and dots all over a piece of canvas can be called art in the same way that a beautiful landscape can be called art. So this is very much on those lines. And it's about, this particular bit here is about German jazz and trying to establish jazz outside of the United States. And jazz, really. Let me go, no, I'll do this later on. I'll say my other bits later on. So I'll get into this and read it now. This is chapter 2, 1971. And it's called The Prince and the Pariah. And it says, the jazz press lives in pillory... It's written wrong. The jazz press loves to pillory pariahs and crown princes and princesses on rare occasions. In the United States, these manufactured controversies have primarily commercial purposes and impacts. However, they had a specific cultural facet in Europe in the 1960s. As the post-World War II generation of European musicians was coming into their own, it was cast in the stereotypical roles to present fissures not only between different jazz aesthetics, but also within the larger cultural agenda of countering American hegemony, all their beef burgers and everything. To this end, European folk music traditions were increasingly tapped. The modes dominating European music through the Middle Ages was reclaimed from the likes of Miles Davis and John Coltrane, while the DNA of blues, I Got Rhythm changes, and other staples of American jazzcraft were re-engineered, if not discarded. Arguably, the country in which these processes were most potently charged in the mid-1960s was the Federal Republic of Germany, routinely referred to in the United States as West Germany. Despite West Germany's formation in 1949, Allied occupation continued until May 1955, almost 2 months after the death of Charlie Parker. Got to know everything by jazz musicians. Anyway, even then the Armed Forces Network and the Voice of America gave the American-centric jazz narrative official, if not imperial, weight. The formation of a new countervailing German jazz identity required a prince, a peer of the most innovative American modernists, who held sway at the most prestigious American venues and who staked out an unmistakably European terrain for his contemporaries. In 1967, Albert Mangelsdorff had been the prince for more than a decade. By the late 1950s, the trombonist had won national polls, represented West Germany in an international youth big band that played the 58 Newport Jazz Festival, and with the Frankfurt All-Stars, advanced a cool West Coast-inspired sound to the forefront of German jazz. So what you've got there is just a German playing African-American jazz, because African-American music, because that's what it was, African-American music. And I don't think we should ever forget that. Although he is routinely cited as extending the modernism of trombonists like J.J. Johnson, it is the influence of saxophonist Lee Konitz that best explains the slyly twisting serpentine lines that distinguish Mangelsdorff's work. In 1962, Mangelsdorff co-led, if in name only, Animal Dance for Atlantic with modern jazz quartet pianist John Lewis, then one of the most ardent African-American champions of European jazz musicians. Despite Mangelsdorff's spirited playing, it is an album dominated by Lewis's admittedly European-influenced sensibilities, a subtly layered reinforcement of the American hegemony critique. Well, Lewis is not so much European influence as classical music influence. So that's you get all these things very muddled up, whether it's jazz or classical music, whether it's European or American. It's hard to sort it all out, really. Mangelsdorff recorded Tensions in 1963, the first of what can be heard as a triptych of recordings foundational to the embryonic project of establishing a European identity in jazz. Although his three-horn quintet with saxophonists Heinz Sauer and Gunther Kronberg, bassist Gunter Lentz and drummer Ralph Hübner are equally adept at hugging the hairpin tones of smart, complex charts and robustly improvising with minimal underpinning. The enduring marker laid down by the album is Mangelsdorff's liner notes, stipulating jazz and an art form reflective of the artist's time and environment. Mangelsdorff proclaims that no one should expect European jazz musicians to play like their African-American counterparts. Additionally, he laments that too few European musicians use jazz's liberty to express themselves, their personality. Capitalization in the original. And I don't understand this, really. If you're playing African-American jazz music, why do you have to convert it into something entirely different? If you want to play European music, well, play European music. Oh, total madness to me. It is debatable how much space Mangelsdorff's put between his quintet and the American contemporaries with tensions. Not so with his next album, Now Jazz Ramwong. Set aside the delicious irony that the bulk of its substantial music innovations are rooted in traditional Asian music, the direct result of the 1964 Goethe Institute-sponsored continent-wide tour. The use of Asian meters and scales moves the music beyond the overhang of American jazz. And the reason they can't use European music to get away from African American jazz is that African American jazz is based on European dance music. If you listen to African American jazz and how it's described when it's written down as dotted crotchets, quavers combination, but when you get told about it, you don't play it like that, you play it like 2-1 pairs of triplet notes, and where do you get that triplet formation? But in European folk dance music, not the folk song music. That's an entirely different thing entirely, as song is always so different from what's played for dance. So European dance music, to my mind, is the foundation of African American jazz. So there's no need to Europeanize it, because that's where it comes from in the first place. But still African American, and the African Americans were the best players of jazz. There's nobody in jazz who's not African American except perhaps Stan Getz, who can rival any of the African American players. It's their music, they know how to play it. But still based on European folk dance music. I suspect I'll get assaulted for all that. Anyway, it is debatable how much space... I've read that. Mangelsdorff fleshes out this thesis with Folk Monde and Flower Dream, his quintet's 67 swan song, spanning ballads and free improvisation friendly forms. The album does not approach folk music with mannered reserve of third stream affiliated composer improvisers like Jimmy Giuffre. I suppose because African Americans, when they're playing European stuff, are moving out of their home territory into European stuff, so you can't expect them to feel at home there. Instead, as Mangelsdorff is quoted in producer Hop Lipnerman's liner notes, the title piece was created with an affinity for rough-hewn street singers. And again, singing is not what jazz is about. Jazz is instrumental music for dancing. So there's nothing to do with singers. That's another one of my hobby horses. I have so many hobby horses. It's untrue. Throughout the album, Mangelsdorff encased emotional churn and urgency in polished ensembles, an approach that soon spread throughout the continent, sparking European jazz's coming of age. In interviews then, and for years to come, Mangelsdorff consistently connected jazz with everyday struggles and protests against the status quo, positions to which his use of folk music lent their firm support. However, he was plagued by market employees like Jazz Made in Germany reviews that compared the music to advanced German automotive engineering and corny publicity photos of the quintet in tuxedos, and even horsing around Beatles-like in a pool, reinforcing his princely status. A prince such as Mangelsdorff required a repugnant pariah, one whose music was the antithesis of the effortless virtuosity and the keen, sophisticated design sensibilities at the core of the trombonist music. For this, the German jazz establishment found an irresistible target in the relatively little-known Peter Brötzmann, or Brötzmann, however you pronounce it, who then represented the most extreme, intense iteration of free jazz. Although the saxophonist had been performing in West Germany and Holland for several years, he had only recently popped up on the national radar, primarily through two 1966 performances. The first was at the 10th German Jazz Festival, Frankfurt. Given the assault on convention Brötzmann's music represented, it is appropriate that his trio with bassist Peter Kowald and drummer Pierre Coubois performed on May Day. Among the other artists performing at the festival was pianist Alexander von Schlippenbach, a member of trumpeter Manfred Schuf's quintet. Seeing a possible triangulation between the Schuf unit's envelope-pushing mix of knotty, hard-driving themes and New Thing, I think that was Brötzmann's band, or something, informed solos and Brötzmann's template-smashing blunt force, Schlippenbach combined the two groups for a composition commissioned by the Berlin Jazz Festival that November. Schlippenbach's Global Unity is now considered one of the most pivotal pieces in European jazz history, but like Stravinsky's Le Sacre de Printemps, it was initially scandalous, a Berlin newspaper characterizing the performance as a pandemonium in which Peter Brötzmann played the role of Satan. Rarely has an artist been as vilified as the saxophonist. Most probably, none faced a televised tribunal like he did on the May 1967 WDR broadcast Free Jazz, Pop Jazz, Incomprehensible or Popular. Certainly not popular. The programme was structured around a panel of experts convened by author Siegfried Schmidt-Juice, then musical editor at Radio Bremen. They discussed the merits or lack thereof of free jazz and questioned whether Brötzmann and saxophonist Klaus Dollinger, whose groups also performed. The primary indictment against Brötzmann was the disqualifying absence of both legitimate instrumental technique and indicators of fluency. Was the legitimate instrument technique and indicators of fluency in prior mainstream vernaculars. So what they're saying there, he's got no technique, he's not been trained in anything, he's not got formal abilities that you can recognise, like reading music or playing ordinary jazz. So he's come out of nowhere, really. Some of the examiners, like journalist Felix Schmidt, methodically laid out the case against Brötzmann. Others, like record producer Siegfried Loch, who began working with Dollinger earlier in the debate, simply dismissed Brötzmann. He shrugged off a previous performance he had attended as amusing. But the most heated responses were by Dollinger, who smugly mocked Brötzmann's playing, and bassist Peter Trunk, who abruptly broke into the exchange to seethe about the lack of technical proficiency in Brötzmann's trio, with keyboard and drummer Aldo Romano. Were it not for journalist Manfred Miller, who hung the jury with his low-key insistence on the general artistic merits of free jazz and the irrelevance of applying conventional jazz metrics to Brotzmann's music, as well as his recognition of its emotional core and its real-time realization of form, Brotzmann would have been found guilty on all counts. A bit hard to read this thing because it's very convoluted writing. Anyway, I'll mention now one of my other key interesting things. We used to, when I was playing over in Newcastle at a jam there, there used to be this alto sax player who used to turn up, and he used to play lots of high notes very fast, and that's what it sounded like, lots of high notes very fast. And to a certain, and you couldn't tell if he was playing properly or not. He just playing lots of high notes very fast. And I blame, to a large extent, a lot of these guitarists who play a lot of high notes very fast, right down the bottom of their guitars, like that. And they may have technique or they may not. Some of them really have got good technique, but it just sounds like a lot of high notes very fast. And so somebody comes along who's not got all that much technique and plays a lot of high notes very fast. You don't know if they're doing the same as these guitar shredders or not. Until one day he came along with a trumpet and he said, I've got one of these because you don't have to buy reeds for them and they're cheaper than saxophones anyway. So he started doing that on the trumpet, a lot of high notes very fast, but they weren't proper notes, they were just noises really. It was just a lot of noises very fast, because you haven't got keys, many keys on the trumpet, and it's not like a saxophone where you move your fingers up and down and you get notes, different notes. It doesn't happen on the trumpet. So we had a trumpet player there who was absolutely offended by this noise that this ex-alto sax player was playing on the trumpet, and he saw him off, chased him out of the room. Anyway, so to carry on with this very difficult book. Through it all, Brotzmann calmly stuck to his story that his music was not for everyone, that he could not explain why he played what he did, that he always knew what he wanted to play, and that the study of the past 50 years of jazz was not necessary to achieve his goals. Because he's not playing that sort of jazz, that's why he's just playing lots of very high notes very fast, or low notes very fast. I think so anyway. Or perhaps he's just not playing jazz, just playing what he feels like. However, Brotzmann did not explicate his musical agenda beyond the panel's satisfaction, beyond generalities of self-expression, begging the question of what he strove for in his music, and assuming you have to strive for something. For this, musical antecedents, even Albert Ayler, whom Brotzmann was first met in 1960, only went so far. For the fuller understanding of its aesthetic and consideration of Brotzmann's visual art is essential. So he was a visual artist as well as a musician. And a lot of people do that sort of thing, one and the other. By 1963, Brotzmann had exhibited his paintings and assemblages in both West Germany and Holland, and had assisted Nam June Paik with his notorious first major exposition of music, maintaining Paik's electronically manipulated pianos and installations involving records and recording tape. Presumably, Brotzmann was not responsible for the freshly slaughtered ox head that hung over their entrance to the show. For this sort of thing, this electronically manipulated pianos and records and things, is very much like scratching, which people do. Arguably, Brotzmann was well on his way to becoming established in European avant-garde visual art by triangulating art brut, abstract expressionism, and the mixed media works of Albert Bury and others. I think by giving them names like that, it legitimizes just anything, really. When they had a subject, his early paintings studied such banal objects as fly swatters, which occasionally bear a passing resemblance to early 50s portraits of Jean Buffet that liken the human form to a blood-bloated tick. Oh, so much ugliness, particularly in 1970s, ugly. All ugly. Don't like ugly. Although they hung on walls and were not freestanding, Brotzmann's works, employing scrap metal and other industrial refuse, had a dark, stark, sculptural quality, devoid of the pop iconography of Robert Rauschmann's combines. Occasionally, Brotzmann incorporated platitudinous components like feathers in found object works, but generally his visual art is unwaveringly blunt. However, that bluntness is not an end in itself, rather it is how Brotzmann rendered form through process. This was Brotzmann's approach to improvised music as well. And it shows you the great parallel between that and the art form. The great artist, what was his name? Oh, I've forgotten his name now. Anyway, I'll come back to him because I've forgotten his name. If anything, Brotzmann had not fully weaponized his music by the time of the WDR broadcast. This is achieved on Machine Gun, a May 1968 octet recording that gathers several principles of the first wave of European free improvisers, including Antwerp-based pianist Fred van Hove and Amsterdam-based drummer Han Benink, with whom Brotzmann formed a trio that loomed large on the continental free music scene through the 1970s. Fueled by piano, twin basses and drums, rounding out the fivesome Kowald bassist Björki Nybergård and drummer Sven Eik Johansson, the jarring, concussive sound of Brotzmann's three-tenor front line with Evan Parker and William Broca, who occasionally switched the bass clarinet to bone-chilling effect, projects a counter to the ecstatic agenda of John Coltrane's Ascension, issued merely 15 months prior to the making of Machine Gun. Instead of a paean to ecstatic transcendence, the tenor smashed contemporary cultural norms with pure fury, with Brotzmann famously quipping that he sought to annihilate the listener. In this regard, Brotzmann's sensibilities stand in sharp contrast to that of his African-American contemporaries, resonating with such touchstones of post-war German art and literature as Joseph Bayer's Art Actions, Bayer's infamously, unexpectedly axed the piano at the 1963 Paik exhibition, and Oscar Mazarath's A Piercing Shriek. That's the picture of a man standing on a bridge with his mouth open. Anyway, Machine Gun was part of a cultural tremor then felt from London and Paris to Prague and Berlin during the spring of '68. One ideal emblematic of the seismic cultural changes afoot was shared by Brotsman and both European colleagues like Broca, a co-founder of Amsterdam's Instant Composers Pool, and Parker, a principal of the Musicians Co-op and Incus Records. And American counterparts was musicians aspiring for and exercising an economic self-determination, the control of the production of performances and recordings. Brotsman joined with Schlippenbach and others based in Cologne and Brotsman's hometown of Wuppertal to form the New Artists Guild, NAG, in 1966, presenting concerts in unorthodox settings, like an underground car park. He released both Machine Gun and its predecessor for Aldous Sax, that's the name of his CD, a 67 trio date with Coward and Johansson. On his own Bro label, short for Brotsman, although it was organised and produced by NAG-affiliated bassist Jos Gerbers, it was Brotsman who initiated the first Total Music meeting in West Berlin in 1968, a critical response to the emphasis on American music, catapulting the Brent-produced Berlin Jazz Days to the top ranks of European jazz festivals in just 4 years. In short, Brotsman was in the thick of changing in West Germany what Nat Hentoff called the political economy of jazz. Oh, that's a very difficult read and probably hard, maybe a hard listen as well. It was Picasso is the artist I was trying to think of, because Picasso was obviously very, very talented artist. If you look at his early work, you see absolute technique there. And he produced sculptures made from bicycle seats with handlebars and all sorts of stuff like that. But he was a proper artist. He knew his stuff and had an artist's eye. A lot of people who tried to follow him didn't have that background, didn't have that knowledge. Anyway, I've now got my notes that, as usual, I looked up on YouTube a couple of the tunes, so I'm not deeply into either of these musicians, but we've got the two musicians here, what's his name? Mangelsdorff and Brotsman. So, as you can tell, I'm not a fan of 70s music, and I was prepared to hate this stuff. Anyway, the Mangelsdorff tune that I listened to, Capriccio Furli, in 1992, was by the Albert Angelsdorff and Wolfgang Doer quartet, and it's very similar to American jazz because he was a German musician playing African American jazz. So, very nice, but it's not German music, it's African American music. And the pianist, Wolfgang, is very interesting. He sounds like a classical pianist. I liked his playing quite a lot. And the other one I listened to of Mangelsdorff was Ant Steps on an Elephant's Toe from 1977 with Jaco Pastorius on electric bass and Alphonse Monson on drums, and that's absolutely brilliant, and Jaco Pastorius is wonderful. But it's all about a groove, really. It's not about a tune, it's about a groove. But that's a very enjoyable piece. particularly for Jaco Pastorius. And again, not un-American. Peter Brötzmann and his main thing, Machine Gun. Depends if you like the music and whether you think effects in music is legitimate or not, or whether they should just be what the instrument produces. The early jazz had lots of effects, and if you listen to Duke Ellington you can hear a lot of those effects, particularly by the trumpeters, and so it's quite legitimate in jazz. And I didn't mind Machine Gun by Peter Brötzmann. It's not my first choice in music. I'd much prefer early Coltrane or Charlie Parker, but it's okay. So if you've stuck with me for that, well done, because this book, Jazz in the 1970s by Bill Shoemaker, is a very difficult read. Thank you.